At 10:23 a.m. on December 20th, 1943, a shape appeared through the fog above the Norfolk countryside. The men in the control tower at RAF Seething thought it was another returning bomber from the morning raid over Bremen. Dozens had gone out, and only a handful had checked in so far. The war had a rhythm: takeoff at dawn, radio silence for hours, then battered formations limping home through the gray English sky. But something about this one was wrong. It was flying too low, too steady. No formation, no escort. The tower operator reached for the binoculars and froze. It was a B-17 Flying Fortress, all right for engines. Olive drab paint, white star roundels on the wings. But one engine was out, propeller frozen in place. Another trailed smoke. The landing gear was already down, and there was no movement inside the cockpit. The airfield crew scrambled outside. The fog made everything ghostly. Outlines of men running across wet tarmac. The hum of the big Wright Cyclone engines rolling across the mist. The aircraft approached perfectly aligned with the runway, steady as if flown by a veteran. Flaps extended, trim set just right, descent angle ideal. No radio call, no signal lamp acknowledgement. It kept coming, graceful and silent except for the engines. Then, with the shuddering thud of wheels hitting ground, the Fortress touched down, a flawless landing. The crew on the ground ran alongside it, waving their arms, shouting for brakes. But none came. The aircraft rolled the full length of the runway, slowing gradually, and finally stopped just short of the embankment. When they reached the fuselage, what they saw defied explanation. The nose compartment was empty. The pilot and co-pilot seats vacant. The controls were locked in neutral position. The throttles set evenly, just above idle. The intercom headset dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently with the vibration of the cooling engines. No sound except the tick of metal contracting in the cold air. The plane had landed perfectly, but there wasn't a single person aboard. Maintenance Officer Flight Sergeant Robert Harper was the first to climb in. He pulled himself through the open hatch beneath the nose and shined his flashlight down the narrow passage. The cockpit was deserted. The bomb bay doors were closed, the release handle untouched. The oxygen masks hung neatly on their hooks. The radio compartment was empty, though the radio itself still hummed faintly. In the waist section, the gun mounts were intact, belts of .50 caliber ammunition still in place, half used. There were blood stains on the floor, small and dried, not enough to suggest mass injury, but enough to tell a story. The tail section showed bullet holes from flak bursts. The crew's parachutes were gone. Every single one. The aircraft's tail number read 42714. Harper wrote it down and handed it to the operations clerk. Within an hour, it was confirmed the plane belonged to the 91st Bomb Group, 324th Squadron, based at Bassingbourn, one of the most battle-tested units in the 8th Air Force. The mission that morning had targeted Bremen's U-boat yards. 60 B-17s had taken off. 14 were missing. One had just landed on its own. They called Group HQ immediately. Within hours, a staff car arrived from Bassingbourn carrying Captain James H. Patterson, intelligence officer, and 2 MPs. The airfield commander met them beside the still-cooling bomber. Patterson's expression hardened as he climbed aboard. He'd seen strange things in the air war, but nothing like this. He went through the same compartments Harper had, noting every detail. The flight logbook lay open on the navigator's desk. The last entry read, "Crossing Dutch coast, heavy flak, 2 engines hit, the time, 9:12. Nothing after that. Patterson found more clues. A torn headset cord near the radio operator's position. A broken oxygen line. A trail of dried blood leading from the top turret hatch toward the rear. In the waist section, 1.50 caliber gun was jammed mid-feed, a shell casing lodged between the bolt and receiver. Near the tail gunner's position, a single bullet hole had punched clean through the armor plate. The gunner's gloves lay folded neatly on the seat and touched. The bomb load release indicators showed empty. The plane had dropped its bombs, completed the run, and then somehow flown itself home. Mechanically, there was no way a fortress could trim itself stable for short periods, sure, but it couldn't navigate 400 miles over enemy territory, clear the North Sea, find England through fog, and land without human control. Even with autopilot engaged, someone had to manage throttles, adjust flaps, compensate for crosswind. But this plane had done all of that. The only explanation was that the crew had bailed out somewhere between Bremen and the English coast, yet no distress call had been received, and no parachutes were reported by coastal radar. By mid-afternoon, word spread across nearby bases. Pilots came to see it, the ghost ship. They walked around it in silence, tracing the flak holes with their fingers, staring into the cockpit like it might start moving again. Someone joked that the plane was haunted. Someone else muttered a prayer. The war was full of strange things, but this was something different. The fortress sat there like a machine caught between two worlds. Its mission finished, its crew vanished. At 1740, the recovery team began towing the bomber into the hangar. The logbook, maps, and onboard film from the gun cameras were removed and sent to Bassingbourn for analysis. The last frame on the navigator's film showed a formation breaking apart under flak, black puffs against pale clouds, one aircraft spinning down in flames. No sign of 4-5-714, then static. The film ended there. That night the engineers drained the fuel tanks. There was enough left for only 20 minutes of flight, which meant that the bomber had made the entire crossing over the North Sea, over the coast, across 2 counties on fumes. It should have run dry long before reaching land. Yet it hadn't. The engines had kept running, synchronized perfectly until the wheels touched ground. The next morning, the search began. Coastal patrols were alerted to look for parachutes or life rafts. Rescue launches scoured the North Sea near the Dutch coast. Nothing. No debris, no bodies, no life vests. The men of 42-5714, Pilot Lieutenant Harold Debble, co-pilot John L. Martin, Navigator William Neary, Bombardier SKT, Lewis Gordon, Radio Operator PVT Paul Green, and 4 gunners had vanished into the war. By December 22nd, the Ghost Bomber became a rumor whispered in the canteens and briefing rooms of every bomber station in East Anglia. Men said it was a sign that some planes refused to die even when their crews did. Others said it was proof the fortress could fly itself home, that Boeing had built something more than metal and rivets, something with a soul. The day after the landing, RAF Seething was still buzzing with rumors. The hangar where the B-17 sat had turned into a pilgrimage site. Mechanics came between shifts just to look at it, the plane that had flown without men. Some took photos. Others stood silently, listening to the faint creak of cooling metal as if it might whisper what had happened. The airfield commander had posted guards, but it didn't stop people from staring through the hangar windows at night. The bomber looked peaceful, even dignified, its nose pointed toward the runway, as if waiting for orders that would never come. Captain Patterson filed his first intelligence report that morning. He kept his tone clinical, but the wording betrayed unease. Aircraft 4-5-7-1 for return from mission without crew. Engines functioning. Controls neutral. All hatches secured except forward entry. Evidence suggests controlled flight to landing. In the margin, someone in the chain of command wrote a single word: impossible. Patterson didn't argue. He knew what impossible looked like. He'd seen B-17s limping home on one engine, fuselages shredded, pilots dead at the controls while the co-pilot held them steady all the way to England. But no one had ever seen a bomber land itself. The 8th Air Force sent an engineering inspection team from Bassingbourn that afternoon. They spent 12 hours inside the aircraft, checking every cable, every hydraulic line, every instrument. Nothing was jammed. The autopilot switch was set to engaged. The elevator trim tab showed neutral pitch. One flap motor was burned out, probably during the final descent, but that could have happened after touchdown. The radio was functional but turned off. The gyro compass pointed east by northeast. The exact course from Bremen to Seething. At noon on December 22nd, a coded message arrived from 91st Group Headquarters. The missing crew of 425-714 had been located, or rather 5 of them. Dutch resistance fighters had reported finding parachutes near the village of Heiken, 30 miles east of the Zuiderzee. Locals hid the surviving airmen until Allied intelligence could extract them. The reports said the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and 2 gunners had bailed out when the aircraft caught fire after the bombing run. 4 others were still missing. Patterson read the telegram twice. If the crew bailed out over Holland, the Fortress had to fly another 300 miles entirely alone. He didn't say the words out loud, but everyone in the room thought them. How? 3 days later, the first survivors reached England. Lieutenant Harold Debold, the pilot, was limping on a bandaged leg when he stepped out of the transport truck at Bassingbourn. Reporters weren't allowed anywhere near him. Patterson conducted the debrief himself. The transcript would later become part of the official investigation. Debold said the mission had gone normally until they hit the coast near Emden. Flak tore through the No. 3 engine, setting it on fire. The co-pilot feathered the prop, but the flames spread along the nutshell. A shell burst under the left wing, rupturing the fuel tank. Smoke filled the cockpit. The interphone crackled with shouts from the waist gunner. Oxygen fire, spreading fast. Debold ordered the crew to bail out. They were still over enemy territory, but the alternative was being roasted alive. He set the bombers heading west, locked the controls, and told his co-pilot to go. He was the last one out. The last thing he saw before jumping was the Fortress flying steady through a veil of smoke, nose down slightly, still holding course. Patterson asked him if the autopilot had been on. Debold nodded. Had to engage it to trim her for level flight. Didn't think she'd keep it long. 2 engines out, half the wing scorched. How long do you think she stayed airborne? Debold hesitated. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Enough to clear the coast. She flew 400 miles, Patterson said quietly. Debold looked at him as if he hadn't heard. That's not possible. That's what I said. When Debold saw the photographs from Seething, the aircraft on the runway, undamaged except for flak holes and the burned engine, he went silent for nearly a minute. She must have found her own way back, he said finally. Guess she didn't want to die over there. Patterson included that line in his report verbatim. Later, a colonel at headquarters crossed it out in red pencil, marking it sentimental. Over the next week, more details emerged. Dutch civilians confirmed seeing a burning B-17 circling at low altitude before leveling out and heading west. One witness claimed he saw the fire extinguish itself, smoke fading as if the wind had snuffed it out. Another said the aircraft climbed slightly before vanishing into the clouds. None of them saw parachutes, but debris was found in the fields, fragments of flak, a section of aluminum skin, a torn oxygen hose. The engineers tried to reconstruct the flight path. With the autopilot engaged and engines throttled evenly, the Fortress could, in theory, maintain altitude until fuel starvation. But the precision of the descent, the alignment with Seething's runway, that was the mystery. The autopilot had no way to identify airfields. It couldn't lower flaps or gear automatically, yet it had done all 3. One theory suggested that aerodynamic damage, the loss of 2 engines, and uneven drag might have caused the aircraft to trim itself into a descending glide that coincidentally matched a landing pattern. Another argued that ground effect near the runway stabilized the descent. None of it explained the timing of the landing gear or the perfect flare before touchdown. On Christmas Eve, the bomber was towed out of the hangar and parked on a dispersal pad. The mechanics painted the words "Ghost Ship" in chalk on her nose. Someone left a small Christmas wreath inside the cockpit. The war went on her, new missions, new losses. But men kept coming to see the plane that had refused to crash. The rest of the crew never returned. 2 were confirmed killed when their parachutes failed to open. The others were listed as missing, presumed captured. None of them had seen the bomber after bailing out. They only knew that she'd been on fire when they left her behind. To them, the idea that she made it back to England was absurd, a myth invented by bored ground crews. Then they saw the photographs. By January 1944, the official investigation concluded. The report ran 20 pages, filled with technical diagrams, flight calculations, and bureaucratic phrasing designed to hide how little anyone truly knew. The final line read, "Likely cause, partial autopilot control maintained until fuel exhaustion. Aircraft coincidentally aligned with runway during descent. In other words, luck, but luck couldn't explain the flaps, or the gear, or the throttle balance." The mechanics who drained the tank swore the engines had been synchronized within 100 revolutions, something even skilled pilots struggled to achieve manually. The propeller angles matched perfectly, as if trimmed by invisible hands. Months later, the bomber was repaired and reassigned to another crew. She flew for more missions before being shot down over France. None of the new crew survived. The name Ghost Ship never left her fuselage. It was painted officially this time, in white letters under the cockpit. Men said they could still smell burned oil in the nose section, even after the overhaul. They said the controls always felt heavier, like the plane was reluctant to turn from the course she knew by heart. Years after the war, when veterans of the 91st Bomb Group met for reunions, someone always brought up the Ghost Bomber. The story changed a little every time. Some swore the engines were cold when she landed. Others said they saw her glide in silently with the props turning like ghosts. No one ever proved what really happened. The mission logbook of 42571 vanished sometime in 1945. The only surviving record was a faded photo of the Fortress sitting alone on the runway, fog curling around her wings. In that photo, the name on the nose art is barely visible, written in chalk by a mechanic who couldn't quite believe what he'd seen: Ghost Ship. In the years that followed, the Ghost Bomber of Seething became one of those stories that moved quietly through the ranks of men who had lived too long with death. Officially, it was dismissed as a technical anomaly, an aircraft trimmed just right, gliding by coincidence into perfect alignment. But no one who had seen her land believed that. Not really. They'd watched too many planes die in fire to think one could come home on its own. By February 1944, the war had swallowed the story whole. New missions, new disasters. Men stopped talking about it aloud, but the rumors spread far beyond East Anglia. Crews in Italy, France, even the Pacific, heard whispers of the flying fortress that came back empty. To some, it was a bad omen, a warning that death could return without a face. To others, it was a miracle, proof that something in those machines cared enough to finish what their crews could not. The mystery might have ended there if not for a curious letter received at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough in late 1946. The sender was a Dutch farmer named Willem Kort from the village of Hyken, the same area where the surviving crew of 42571 had bailed out. Enclosed was a small photograph, faded and yellowed, showing a charred section of aircraft fuselage, with a serial number barely legible. 42571. Kort claimed he had found the wreckage of a B-17 wingtip buried in his field that spring. It was embedded deep in the soil, as if torn off midair. Nearby he'd unearthed a section of hydraulic line and what looked like the remains of a parachute harness. The discovery puzzled investigators. If the aircraft had lost part of its wing, it should have gone down immediately. Yet the flight data and physical evidence in England proved that the bomber had arrived intact. The most likely explanation: the wingtip belonged to another plane. But Kort was adamant. The numbers matched, and the metal bore the faint stencil markings of the 91st Bomb Group. Someone filed his report, stamped it "No action required," and buried it in an archive. The Ghost Bomber slipped back into silence. 20 years later, the war had faded into history. Airfields were quiet, and most of the men who had watched her land were gray-haired civilians now. But in 1963, an aviation historian named David Masters stumbled across a reference to the incident while researching declassified U.S. Army Air Forces reports. The phrasing caught his eye. Aircraft returned to base without crew. Landing gear deployed. Flaps down. No fatalities aboard. It read like fiction. Masters tracked down surviving members of the 91st Group. Many had forgotten the exact date, but every man remembered the feeling. One mechanic, Tom Latham, recalled standing on the runway that morning, watching the B-17 approach. "I thought the pilot was dead at the controls," he said. "She was coming in too smooth, like she didn't need him." Another, an armorer named Bill Carter, remembered climbing into the empty fuselage and hearing what he swore was a low hum even after the engines had stopped. "Like the plane was breathing," he said quietly. "We'd just never noticed it before." Masters wrote an article for Aviation Weekly titled "The Day a Fortress Came Home Alone." It was published in April 1964 and reignited interest in the case. Letters poured in from veterans who claimed to have heard similar stories. An unpiloted Liberator in Italy, a Mustang found intact in France, a Dakota transport that landed itself in Burma. Most were fabrications or confused retellings. But one letter stood out. It was from a man in Chicago who identified himself as former Staff Sergeant Jeans Holloway, the radio operator from the original crew of 42-5714. Holloway had been captured after the bailout and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp near Bremen. He confirmed that the autopilot had been engaged, but he added a detail no one had recorded before. "Before we jump," he wrote, "Lieutenant Debble told me to say a prayer for her. He said, 'She's done her job. Let's see if she can take herself home.'" We all thought he was joking. Holloway never saw the plane again, but when he learned that she had landed safely in England, he said it didn't surprise him. "Those fortresses," he wrote, "sometimes felt alive. You could sense when they wanted to bring you back." When Masters tried to verify Holloway's letter, he found the veteran had died 2 months earlier. The postmark was dated 3 days before his death. The story took on a new weight. A man's final confession about a moment too strange to explain. In 1972, the airfield at Seething was decommissioned. The hangars were demolished, and the runways turned to farmland. The exact spot where the Ghost Bomber landed is now a quiet patch of grass bordered by hedgerows. A small stone memorial marks the site, in memory of the airmen of the 91st Bomb Group. Their courage brought them home. Visitors who come there say the wind moves differently across that field, quieter somehow, heavier. Locals call it the Whispering Runway. Some nights, when fog rolls in from the east, they claim to hear engines in the mist, for propellers beating faintly above the trees, then fading away toward the sea. Of course, no one believes in ghosts. Not really. The rational explanation remains the same: trim, gravity, luck. Engineers at Boeing even recreated a simulation in 1984 using a B-17 flight trainer. Under near-identical conditions, the aircraft could indeed maintain stable flight for over an hour without input. But in every simulation, it eventually stalled, crashed, or ran out of altitude long before reaching a runway. The model couldn't replicate the landing. The autopilot of 1943 simply wasn't capable of lowering flaps or gear automatically. "There's no mechanical explanation for that part," one engineer admitted. "But machines sometimes behave unpredictably under stress." The historian Masters visited RAF Seething one last time before his death in 1991. He brought the old photograph, the one showing the emptied bomber resting on the runway, and laid it at the base of the memorial stone. His final notes in a private journal read, "Perhaps the machine remembered. Perhaps, for once, the steel missed the men as much as the men missed her." He never published that line. Today, the story of the Ghost Bomber exists in fragments, archived reports, fading photos, second-hand memories. Most historians file it under anomalies of flight alongside other wartime legends. But among pilots, it remains something more. They call it the ultimate act of loyalty, a machine that refused to die until it had brought its crew home. Even if only their memory. On quiet nights, museum curators at Duxford, where a restored B-17 stands gleaming under spotlights, say they sometimes find the propellers turn slightly by morning, just enough to catch the light. Maybe it's air pressure, maybe the floor shifts, or maybe, as one old mechanic once said with a shrug, she's just getting ready to go home again. The story of the Ghost Bomber faded, like all stories from that era eventually do, but it never completely disappeared. It lived quietly in the corners of old flight manuals, in the half-whispered toasts of veterans' reunions, in the way mechanics touched the nose of a parked aircraft as they walked by, a silent gesture of respect, superstition, or gratitude. For many of them, it wasn't about what had happened that morning in 1943. It was about what it meant. Men who flew the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force had seen too much to be sentimental. They were practical, fatalistic, burned down to instinct. Yet even among them, there were moments when logic failed, when something unseen seemed to pull a dying machine just a little farther, a little closer to home. They'd call it luck or training or divine providence. But deep down, some wondered if their aircraft carried something of them, fragments of courage and memory stitched into aluminum, moving long after the men themselves were gone. In the decades that followed, B-17 restorations became a quiet industry. Old airframes recovered from Alaska, Greenland, and Pacific jungles were brought back to life by volunteers who were too young to have fought the war, but old enough to understand reverence. Each rivet mattered. Each dent told a story. At airshows across America, when the restored flying fortresses roared back to life, crowds would fall silent. There was always that same sound, deep, rhythmic, human somehow, like a pulse. In 1997, a journalist from the Times of London revisited the Ghost Bomber's case for a feature titled "The Plane That Flew Itself Home." She interviewed the last living witness from RAF Seething, a retired mechanic named Alan Rowe. He was 81. He spoke softly, carefully, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. "I was standing about 50 yards from the runway when she came in," he said. "The flaps were down, wheels out, perfect approach. No radio, no pilot, no nothing. I saw right through the cockpit glass. Empty. It wasn't eerie then, you know. It just looked, right, like she'd been here before." When asked if he believed in ghosts, Rowe smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but I believe in loyalty. That plane didn't want to die over enemy soil. She'd seen too much of that already." That sentence stayed with readers long after the article was printed. It wasn't a statement about machines or miracles. It was about something older, the invisible thread between men and what they build in moments of desperation and faith. War creates things meant to destroy, but sometimes those things remember creation. By the early 2000s, the original hangar at Seething was gone. The memorial stone remained, overgrown with moss. A few aviation enthusiasts kept the Ghost Bomber's story alive on early internet forums, scanning the surviving photos and mission reports. One of those photos, the empty cockpit, frost on the glass, became a symbol in its own right. It wasn't about the supernatural. It was about presence, absence, and the impossible space between them. In 2011, a retired U.S. Air Force colonel named Frank Myers visited the site. His father had served in the 91st Bomb Group. He brought with him a small aluminum panel, part of a recovered B-17 wreck from northern France. On it, he'd engraved 4 words: "She found her way home." He placed it at the memorial and stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the grass where the runway once lay. Later, he said, you could still feel something there, not a ghost, not a spirit, just the weight of memory. When he returned to his hotel that night, Myers found a message on his phone from a historian at Duxford. They had been cataloging equipment from decommissioned RAF bases, and among a pile of rusted tools and notebooks was an old brass tag stamped with the number 425714. No one knew how it got there. No record showed it had ever been transferred. It was small enough to hold in a palm the identification plate from an engine cowling, somehow preserved through decades of war, reconstruction, and forgetting. He donated it to the museum's collection. It sits in a glass case now, under soft light, beside a propeller blade from another B-17. There's no dramatic caption, just a line of text that reads, "Recovered from RAF Seething, December 1943. Returned alone." Visitors don't always notice it. It's quiet, but for those who do, it has a strange gravity. You can almost see your reflection on the dull metal, faint, blurred, like a memory surfacing for a second before sinking again. Every few years, someone writes to the museum asking if the Ghost Bomber was real. The curators always give the same answer: yes, the records exist. The photographs are genuine. Then they add almost reluctantly, "We just don't know how." Maybe that's what keeps the story alive, the refusal of certainty, the idea that somewhere in the fog of war, there are moments when logic and physics step aside to make room for something human, something that doesn't need to be seen to be true. If you ask a pilot, they'll tell you that flying is a conversation between machine and man, trust and risk. You don't control a plane. You negotiate with it. You learn its habits, its moods. You sense when it wants to climb, when it trembles, when it's hurt. Maybe, just maybe, those machines learned a little about their pilots too. On December 20th every year, at precisely 10:23 a.m., a few locals still gather near the old Seething airfield. They bring coffee in thermoses, sometimes a small American flag, sometimes nothing at all. They stand in silence and listen to the wind. Some swear they hear a low drone in the distance, for engines, faint, steady, approaching through the fog. No one speaks. No one takes pictures. They just watch the sky. History remembers victories and losses, but it often forgets the quiet mysteries in between, the moments that defy explanation, that remind us courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it's written in metal, sometimes it flies home on its own. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war, stories about loyalty, fate, and the strange bond between men and the machines they trusted with their lives. Subscribe, and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Did someone in your family serve? These stories live on because people like you keep them alive. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the ghosts of war don't haunt. They just come home,